And here we are.
And welcome back.
At 9. Michael, Pastor Michael, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing okay. Does it say that we're live? Because I don't see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't?
It says we're live, but
Maybe you're live.
Wait, did you guys both create a box cast tonight?
Oh, no. A StreamYard.
A StreamYard?
I don't know. Are we here?
Create one or take my link?
I took your link.
Ah, then it should be on.
Are you here?
Well, we're on the same
Comment
ones.
if you're here, friends.
Someone is
Yes,
here.
we're live.
Okay.
Michael, do you not see you?
Well, I mean, am I invisible to you, Jody?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
We
Are
see
invisible?
you.
Hi, everyone.
Hi,
It
Denise.
looks like...
Look, it looks like you're on.
Hey, there it goes. It just joined. It just popped on. So
No, it just popped
Oh.
on. Man, there's like a little
Great.
delay there.
That's so funny.
See, you switch
Hi,
networks
Fiddlers.
and it all breaks down.
Okay, so it's good. We're all
Yeah.
all here.
Conflict
Hello.
at the bottom.
Okay,
All
so
right.
Jody, do you see all of us?
Yeah.
You
This is
see
like
all three of us?
this is like what happens when you have to help your parents with technology. That's
Yeah.
what it feels like. That's what I
Well, we
do.
were wondering. We're like, you're not speaking.
I've been visible
We
all
are
along.
live.
So the fiddlers,
Oh,
we
it's great. So you
we're-
got all that. That's a free show.
Hi, you lefties.
have
Hi.
not moved into another dimension.
You've been visible all along. Okay, perfect. I think we have been visible all along. I think Michael couldn't see himself until
See.
after the fact. So,
It's LHC 3-ring circus. That's
welcome to our
Might be
show.
having some problems. Yeah, we'll be doing balloon tricks later.
Yeah. Hi, Anne. Okay, good. It looks like we are good to go.
Yeah, great. So we have been we've been talking through the past. It's actually been, I think, one of the more fruitful journeys we've taken in at 9 and the year and change we've been doing it. Talking about really some big issues based around the idea of what one of the writers we've quoted often, Peter Scazzaro, talks about as emotionally healthy spirituality. And it was interesting today. Darian, Andy, and I were talking with another friend of ours who's a pastor, and just talking about the role that this kind of journey has played in all of our lives in different ways, in leadership, in being a follower of Jesus, and being husbands and wives and mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers, and just all of it. It impacts. And really the idea has been that you cannot be spiritually mature without also growing up in the way that you deal not only with your emotions, but how you deal with other people.
Yeah.
So there's a maturity that those two things go hand in hand, because really the reason for that is this, that the expression of spiritual maturity, at least as Jesus saw it, or at least as some of the early writers in the New Testament saw it, wasn't how much theology you knew or how much Hebrew or Greek you could drop. It was how you loved other people. And so that's really the bottom line for this for us. And we want to be people who follow Jesus, but also reflect Jesus in how we interact with others. And I think all of us here want to do that. But we run into challenges doing that. And one of the things that started to come out last week was we started to talk about the issue that is something none of us like to actually talk about. And it's this word right here, conflict. How many of you love conflict? You just love getting in fights with people or disagreeing with them, or people you love.
Love it now.
Maybe a couple of you who really just like to argue or something like that. But most of us, we don't like this thing, but it is a part of our lives. Like all of the relationships that you have that are significant involve at some point, if they continue to grow, they involve conflict. And one of the things I've discovered, maybe you've discovered this too, Andy and Daria, is Christians don't do conflict very well.
Yeah, Bruce.
no, not at all.
No, we do not do conflict well at all.
No.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think especially as Christians, many years ago, for me, it was I tend to run away from it. I don't even want to engage in it. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, put anyone off. So rather than engage in this what is really a healthy activity. It's awkward, of course. It's rough. There's some stuff going on. It's messy, but it's needed. It's fruitful. So I'd run away from it. So that's one reason why we don't do conflict. Or it's.
I think pride is
yeah.
another thing. I think there's layers to why we're in conflict, and nobody wants to get to the layers to go after what's really wrong.
And we don't deal with our junk.
We want to just say everybody else is wrong. So we want to just put all the conflict off on the other person. Meanwhile, we're afraid, or we don't want to look in the mirror and see how we are part of the conflict. Conflict takes two people. So there's some part of you that is involved, and you just don't want to see that or go through the process of figuring out what that looks like.
Or you react way too sharply to things because you've been burnt somewhere before. You haven't dealt with your inner stuff. And so it all comes pouring out.
Yeah, you guys are doing an amazing.
We're not talking about any experience.
I could go on and on.
Honestly, I think it sparked, like you said in the conversation we had earlier today, I think it sparked for all of us a place of wanting to be healthy. And there is no way you can be healthy if you avoid conflict at every level and every angle of your life. So it's not comfortable. It's not something you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh, I hope we have conflict today. Unless there's something really wrong with you. No one says that, really. You don't want to start conflict, with just anyone or for no reason. It's usually there's something going on, and you got to go after it.
Yeah, and Bruce is quoting from the New Testament book of Ephesians, chapter 4, which, by the way, at Long Hill Chapel in a number of weeks, we will be getting to chapter 4.
Yes.
We're going through that. And the passage he's quoting from verse 15. And the Apostle Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, he had previously, just before this verse, he said, we're no longer going to be infants. We're no longer going to be tossed around. We're no longer, like I have an infant, and he's actually a really chill baby. But little kids, basically their feelings are their reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the Apostle Paul is saying in this verse that Bruce is quoting right before it, he says, we're no longer going to be ruled that way. Instead, speaking the truth in love, will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. And so there's this idea that growth takes truth when we have to confront the truth, or maybe when we have to help someone else see the truth. That is conflict. That is the very definition of it. It is when your versions of reality, or your versions of what's real or what's true, collide with each other, and they don't match up. And so, yeah, April, you're absolutely right. Conflict is inevitable.
It is.
So it's important to learn how to do it well. And it doesn't mean that it's pleasant, but it does mean that it's necessary. It does mean that you can't avoid everything forever. You can't run away, or you can't deflect onto all the other people around you and take no responsibility for the things that you find in your lives. But here's the thing, and this is where part of our conversation was going earlier. One of the things that makes it so challenging, I mean, it's never easy, but I think, and you guys, if you who are watching and listening, maybe you can relate to this. One of the things that makes it really challenging is that it's not linear. It's not linear. It's not like, hey, we're going to talk about this issue and then we're going to be done talking about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's always got all these like turns and twists and difficulties, and that's the thing I really wanted to start to talk about. And Jean, thank you for your just being transparent and vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think one of the things you're starting to get to with this is what's hard is you cannot control the other person. You can't
right.
You can't, you can only be responsible for you. And that's one of the things that makes this so complex. But one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight, and we're going to spend some time here. So if you hate conflict, probably at 9 is not going to be the easiest place for you. But I think if we learn to do this well, this is something that is incredibly healthy and actually builds our relationships. Not that we go looking to pick fights,
right?
But that we actually, for the purpose of restoration or for the purpose of our own freedom, we learn how to engage with this.
I think we look at the words conflict and confrontation as negatives, And because like when there's conflict, usually there's a confrontation or a sit down or something. So we associate that. Well, for me, it
the
is.
Italian side of you come out.
For me,
Gotta
it
sit
is.
down.
So you look at it as a negative instead of seeing that confrontation and a resolution to the conflict can be a positive. You could walk out of something so much healthier and just in line with the other person if you just sit down and deal with whatever the conflict is and not be afraid of entering into that conflict.
Yeah, and Bruce, you're alluding to something which I think is one of the reasons we avoid it at times. Is it's a learned, like dealing with conflict well is a learned skill. It's like a practice. It's something that you need to learn how to do. You need to learn yourself. You need to learn your reaction points. It's like, learning a sport or a musical instrument or riding a bike or anything like that. It's not something like you do it once and it doesn't go super well and you're like, I'm never doing that again because I'm not good at it. That would be like if you're like my son has just started playing baseball this year. One of the journeys I have with him is you've got to keep practicing. You've got to keep trying. If you don't have a great game or if you don't get a hit, it doesn't mean you give up. You try again. You make some investments, and that's one of the I think the key things with this. But what makes this challenging, and this is kind of what I wanted to spend a little time on tonight, is this phenomena that I've called the issue behind the issue. And how many of you've entered into conflict with someone else and suddenly something happens and it just like it becomes something much bigger than it ever was. Like sometimes if you're married people, you do this and it's like some issue, it's like taking out the trash or some mundane small issue, but it triggers something much bigger. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? And you're like, it's like it goes like nuclear, or the other person responds disproportionately, or if we're honest with ourselves, we're confronted with something.
The
response is disproportionate to the issue. And have you ever wondered why that's the case? Like, why is this person like, going nuclear, going all the way to the top of the scale? Or why do I feel like I want to murder this other person and it's over some small thing? And that's kind of what this gets to, is one of the things that makes conflict really challenging is that you're really never ever just dealing with the issue at hand. You're dealing with all of the other stuff below the surface.
Right.
And that's true for you and it's true for the other person. And so you're dealing with things like this. You're dealing with past pain or trauma, but also unhealthy coping mechanisms that have allowed you to survive. Like one of the things I've discovered for people who, exactly. You hit a nerve. You're like, whoa, what did I just do?
Yeah.
Yep.
But one of the things I've discovered is that, and maybe some of you who are in relationships or married, you've discovered this, is you actually learn how to fight from somewhere. Or you learn how to deal with conflict from your family of origin. You watch your parents do it, or you watch some other person, and that's how you you figure out how to do it. Like my family growing up, I'll just be transparent. Like my mother and I were highly argumentative. We both liked to win. And it was actually, we enjoyed arguing. And so there were times where we actually got to the point where we were basically agreeing, but one of us couldn't let the other have the last word. And we almost didn't take it too personally. It was almost kind of like a sport. And, I discovered taking that into some of my other relationships that it was like really, really not healthy. Just overwhelm someone and shut them down, and it became this very unhealthy dynamic. But we all have watched, or we've all learned our patterns of conflict or interaction from somewhere, from someone else. And sometimes even what we've done is we've learned habits that have allowed us to survive emotionally, like shutting down or running away or going on the attack or something like that, and they allow us to survive some phase of our life. But they're not really very healthy. And the problem with them is they worked well enough to get us to this point. And that kind of teaches us that, hey, this works, so this is how I'm going to do this. And so what happens is there's all of these other things that are actually below the surface that get accessed or they get triggered when we enter into conflict. And the thing is, here's the thing that's tricky about this is most of the time we're not aware of it. Most of the time the other people aren't aware of it. Like you go through life and everything is pretty normal, but then there's this like Elizabeth, you said, you hit a nerve. There's this, you get bumped, or someone bumps you, or you bump them, and it just triggers this response.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's like you have someone who seems like, how many of you, like, have you ever had someone, they're actually pretty nice most of the time, but once you get them in conflict, it is like you're dealing with a different person.
A whole other person, yeah.
Like the tentacles come out, and, you know, it's super intense. That's kind of what that is. And but there's all this stuff under the surface. And the tricky thing is you don't really see it until you're in those moments. And that's a terrible time to try to deal with it.
Yeah.
For both parties.
For both parties. Yeah.
Yeah. Because sometimes the person doesn't even realize that it happened, like why it happened. And then the other person's not a mind reader. So how are they to know, you know, what they just stepped into? So it's, not the moment.
It's like people who you can have a high threshold for kind of being poked, you know, but as soon as you hit the one spot that's got a splinter underneath the surface, again, the issue behind the issue, they'll fly off the handle. They go absolutely nuts. So people that may seem like they have a high threshold for taking a lot of other people's stuff, maybe you hit that one part and it's, oh man, snap city. Yeah, it's usually
deeper.
Yeah, explosive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and usually at that point, what's happened is it's gotten so critical.
Right.
There's nobody who's like, hey, let's deal with this in a rational fashion.
Mm-hmm.
No, right.
Right.
Let's get through out of this, survive this.
Mm-hmm.
And once it's gone, I don't know if you've done this or experienced this, but once you're on the other side of it, however that happens,
whether
it's healthy or not, you're like, let's tiptoe away and never touch that again.
Yeah.
Because it's like it almost inoculates us from wanting to address it with someone else or to deal with it in ourselves. And so what happens is we never deal with the issue behind the issue, except when it comes out in conflict. And then it's so critical and so intense that we're really just trying to avoid it or get away from it in any way we possibly can. An illustration I've used, they're in storage somewhere and I'd make a big mess in my house and it wouldn't be good. But think about like taking two open jars and filling them with beads or marbles or whatever of a couple different colors. And one of those jars represents you, and those beads represent all the stuff that makes you you. Some of that's good and some of that's healthy and some of that's not good and some of that's not healthy. And the other person has their jar and it's also full of that stuff. And when you get into conflict, it's like you bump each other. It's like those two jars bump each other. And if those two jars are full, what happens? The beads, they do a bunch of things, right, Andy? They spill out.
Yeah.
They make a mess everywhere, but some of the beads spill from one jar into the other and vice versa. And as I said, I wish I could do the illustration for you. But my beads are in storage somewhere. But it's just like some of your issues spill into the other person's life, and then some of their issues spill into your life. And so you end up actually kind of making these deposits in each other's lives. And that happens when you bump. So your issues bump up against the other person's issues. You actually end up carrying a piece of that, and they end up carrying a piece of that. And that actually is something that continues to trigger how we deal or how we don't deal with conflict. There's a little passage in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus speaks, believe it or not, Jesus speaks about this exact issue. And this is a sobering little passage. Luke chapter 6, and it's one of those long chapters, verse 40 through 45. Derry, do you want to read that?
Sure. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of.
Yeah.
I like that one. Should I say it again?
Yeah, say that again.
For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of.
This should be a very sobering thing for many of us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That really, what you are full of, what I'm full of, it's not revealed by our best intentions, and it's not revealed by our best behavior.
Mm.
Right.
It's revealed by our worst moments.
Yeah.
And so what's really in there, what's really in that jar of beads that spills out into other people's lives, is not revealed by when we have all the margin and bandwidth and space
Right.
to manage ourselves and put on the best front. It's when we're caught, when
Yeah.
Pastor, we were talking about this earlier, just how this manifests for each of us.
Yeah.
And we all have stuff like this, as nobody is exempt from this. And so really, one of the other translations says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Yeah.
And so, whatever's down in the well comes up in the bucket. There's a lot of ways to say this. And so at your worst moments, not at your best moments,
Mhm.
at your worst moments, at my worst moments, what comes out of us reveals what's actually inside all along.
Yeah.
And that's pretty sobering.
So yeah,
Mhm.
it is.
And I think what happens a lot of times with this is what we do is we instead of dealing with the stuff that's inside, we try to deal with the externals. We talk about the other person, we try to manage our environment, and that's all good. But Jesus basically says it's not about what's inside, it's about, or what's outside, it's about what's inside.
Right.
And he says that's like a truth throughout the Gospels and throughout the New Testament. We're always like, look at the evil that's out in the world. Jesus is like, look at what's in your heart. Start there. And Jody, you're saying some good stuff here. Usually, we're brushing stuff under the rug to avoid the conflict. There's a real issue. There's little issues that signal the bigger issue.
Yeah.
And so we kind of tiptoe around it, or we never really confront it. Because who really likes to do this unless you're some kind of pessimist?
Yeah.
April says we can fool ourselves into thinking we have healthy relationships by not dealing with minor relationships on the issue on the regular. But when a bigger issue arises, it's kaboom. Now, and it's also the accumulation of all those minor things.
Yes,
Right.
right. You've now been taken advantage of because you've allowed that stuff to build up. So the next thing that happens, it's not just the one issue; it's all the other ones that are stacked up behind it that you felt some kind of way about and still do.
Yeah, they don't just go away.
No, it's unresolved. No closure, unresolved conflict, and it never ends well. Never. Yeah, you always feel resentful when that's happening, and there's always someone to blame for it,
Right.
and you carry that around with you. So next time that person, it's a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, and there's actually a couple different, maybe all of you who are listening to this, there's a couple different places we find ourselves or ways we deal with this. Some of you are like get it out and fight it out people, and some of you are bottle it up people.
Yeah.
And what I've just discovered, especially in marriages, is a lot of times you have one of one and one of the other. It's kind of that fight or flight thing again. But you really, with conflict, and that's anywhere where you feel offended or you cause offense, there's really two legitimate choices. One is to deal with it directly.
Mm-hmm.
The other is to release the other person from it.
Yeah.
To overlook the offense. Those are the only two options.
Right. And you're saying to deal with it, right? That's not. Yeah.
Yeah. You either have to deal with it together, or you have to release it. You have to.
That's good. Yeah. In order to resolve it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only way it goes away. Otherwise, it just accumulates and it becomes.
Yep.
An issue that's kind of behind the issue. I don't know if this is true for you guys, but a lot of times the closer you are to someone, the easier it is for them to bump you.
Oh, yeah.
That's why the people who know you, like the people you live with, they know all your buttons.
Yes.
She gets bumped a lot.
Boop. And then mom explodes. I'm just kidding. It's true though, because you are the closest with them, so you know. You know those buttons, you know those things.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes though, like if kids are involved, like they might not know, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's another part of it too, whether they're older or younger, they don't always know. But yet they're one of the closest with you. They're in
Yeah.
your home. They know you best.
And
And
well,
yet-
especially kids, they push your buttons anyway.
Yeah.
Like it's just
Yeah, you want to know what's in your
Their
the
job,
overflow of your
yeah.
heart. You'll, even if you love them, and I mean, it's the people you love. It's not that you don't love them. It is
Right.
that.
And there's even conflict within.
it's like the ultimate patience test. Like if you were at a carnival, that would be how they would test your patience. They have you in there
Mm.
with a middle school age kid.
We have a couple
How
of
far
comments.
can you go? We did, yeah.
I
I
think
think-
that the inability of being transparent for fear of how one is viewed.
Yeah, that's
Hinders
really.
the communicate. Oh, sorry. It continues. Hinders the communication and doesn't allow healing. And that's true.
Being in conflict, Elizabeth, that's really good.
Yeah.
Being in conflict requires that you're vulnerable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Being in honest, healthy conflict.
Mhm.
Right.
You can go beat someone up or attack them or do something like that and be invulnerable, but saying I'm going to have this conflict for the purpose of trying to restore the relationship and resolve the issue.
Mhm.
Absolutely requires both sides to come out of their corners.
Yes. Right.
The people who would bottle it up and not really speak the truth that needs to be spoken, they need to be vulnerable and take the risk of maybe saying something they wouldn't otherwise say.
Right.
The person who goes on the attack and just is combative in conflict needs to step it back and suck it up and listen in it. But both of those, what it does in both cases, both of those responses are manifestations of control.
Yes.
Mhm.
You're saying, I'm not going to deal with this. And by the way, Christians have a version of this. It's called, I'm going to go pray about this.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are times where you need to take a moment. You need to, push the timeout button. You need to not let your feelings rule you,
Yeah.
but you still need to deal with it. You cannot pray away. Hear this.
No.
You cannot pray away conflict. You can pray away the emotions around it. You can give those to Jesus.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But you can't make it go away by praying it away because conflict has to be resolved with the other person.
Right.
And you said, oh, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, you said something a little while ago. I didn't want to go too far without something that just stuck with me here. It's the only way to restore a relationship is by going through the conflict and resolving that together. Forgiveness is different. There's no restoration of a relationship with simply forgiveness. You're releasing that person of their offense, of what you believe you're owed by their offense, but that does not restore the relationship.
Mm-mm.
So it takes both sides, like you said, coming out of your corners and dealing with it together
Stepping
to
into
restore the relationship.
Yeah. And let me just speak to something else that came to mind is there are, this assumes a healthy conflict, or at least a relatively non-toxic conflict.
it.
Some of
Mhm.
you all have people in your lives who are toxic, meaning when they're in conflict with you, they are not there to restore the relationship and address the issue. They're there to injure you. They're there to do damage.
Mhm.
And that is a boundaries conversation.
Yes.
That is, yes, where you pray for them and you pray that God will do what only God can do. And that's where you have to realize where the line of responsibility is. And in any conflict, and we talked about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, is saying, what part of this can I be responsible for?
Right.
Mhm.
Realistically, if it's 1% or 10% or 20% or whatever, but what's the number that is something that I can take ownership of? And being honest about, just, not, this isn't about who gets the blame. It's about how can we help restore this? What's the thing that I can carry to help restore this?
Mhm.
But there's some people, and unfortunately, maybe for some of the folks who are watching this, there's some people who are not there to restore the relationship. They're there to manipulate. They're there to control. They're there to cause damage.
Mhm.
And you can't at that point restore the relationship until there's common ground that can be gotten on, if ever.
Right.
What you can do is to release that.
Yeah.
And again, that's what I said. Before, it's either you deal with it or you release it, but it's
Mhm.
releasing it, and that's not even for the other person. That's for you.
For you. Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's for you. That's for you to not be fooled, to not be held bondage
Yeah.
Mhm.
by this. But that's the thing, is you can't come in good faith to resolve conflict if the other person is not acting in good faith.
Mhm.
Right.
But again, it's vulnerability. It's a mutual level of vulnerability, and it's one of the tricky things, especially in ongoing relationships with this, is this ending up in a balanced fashion. Because a lot of times what happens is one person will actually take more responsibility than is theirs to take, and the other person will never take the responsibility that's theirs to take.
Mhm.
So the person who just wants things to be okay again ends up being responsible for things that aren't them, just to restore the peace.
Mhm.
And so that's not a healthy dynamic. But it's just understanding, I think, what we're dealing with tonight is it's realizing that whenever this happens, it's not just the issue at hand. It's
Right.
all the stuff under the surface.
Mhm.
And so I think just a great place for us to start is to really, it's not like a super happy place,
Mhm.
but is to really be honest about a couple of different things, and to really look at our lives. And one question you can ask is this: is what comes out of you when you get bumped?
Mhm.
When you get bumped, what's your reaction? What's the thing that happens? And what I mean by that is when you get kind of surprised, when someone else runs into your life a little bit, and there's that initial response. What is that?
Right. Yeah.
And and to be really honest about it, and not to justify it, and not to rationalize it, and not to explain it away, but just to say, what is there here? What does this really get at? One of the things that's interesting. Here's an example of this. Have you ever ended up in conflict with someone, and you're talking to them, but it actually sounds like someone else from your past that you're talking to?
Yes.
Hmm.
Like you're having this conflict or argument or disagreement or whatever, but it feels like you're actually talking to your mother or your father or some other person from your past. That's one of the tricky things about getting bumped. It just triggers all of these.
And you can't attach those to the person that you're in and with at that moment.
Yeah.
Or you're talking like that person.
Oh yeah.
You're no longer yourself.
Yeah.
You're that person who
Yeah.
used to talk to you the way you're talking to this other person.
Right. Right.
Oh,
Yeah. Troy says sometimes what comes out depends on the person that surprises you. Absolutely. 100%. Because there's actually, like we've said, with a lot of these things, there's patterns. There's learned patterns. There's patterns. Maybe there were coping mechanisms. Maybe they're just what you observed and learned from your parents or whoever. And so, we kind of, when we see something that looks and reminds us of something else, we respond with the pattern very often that that evoked. And it was interesting. I was talking to Pastor Andy earlier today. I grew up, my parents both loved me, but my mother had very, very high expectations of me. And so anything that was less than perfect was probably not good enough many times. And so as a child, I constantly was getting caught. And I would just feel like 2 inches tall. This is as when I was a kid. And what's interesting is, to this day, when there's anything that evokes that same kind of thing where I feel like I've been embarrassed or exposed or caught, I feel like I'm 7 years old again. And we all have stuff like that. That's an example of me getting bumped. What comes out when you get bumped? And Denise, you're saying, I feel scared that the person won't like me. That actually, there's something under that that says I must be liked and approved of to be okay.
Right.
That's it. Right.
And for some of us, conflict is like, that's the worst opposite version of that, because it's not okay, and there's something wrong here, and it's bad.
Yeah.
And so I think for all of us, for all of you, it's just would be such a good exercise to be really honest and say, what really comes out of me
Right.
bumped. And kind of with that, the second one, which kind of goes with what we've been talking about tonight, is what is an issue behind the issue in your life that shows up and makes everything seem so much bigger? Like when you get into conflict, and maybe there's more than one of these. We all have different versions of these. But what's the thing? What's the overflow of your heart? In the words of Jesus, that when you get bumped, suddenly it's there. It's like right there, and it's the thing that is now the real thing that's going on. It's not about not taking out the trash or whatever trivial issue or silly thing that someone said. Another way in relationships that you can find this is true is if you find yourself or you find the other person saying you always or you never.
Yeah, right. Right.
And April just wrote that I'm not lovable.
Sorry. Yeah, that's yeah,
and that's deep too.
That is deep. Thanks for being vulnerable with that, April.
Yeah. Oh, did he freeze?
Frozen.
Michael,
if you listen to
frozen.
Sunday's message, no. But yeah, it's Ephesians 1.
Oh, he's back.
There
You're back. Say what you said again because you froze.
Guys saying here's kind of how that one in particular illustrates out. Every conflict at that point becomes a referendum on whether you are worthy of love.
Right. Yep.
It's saying, okay, this didn't go right, and it's not about whatever the issue is. It's about, am I deserving and worthy? Am I lovable?
Right.
And that's a much bigger issue.
And how you act out of that, whether that's defensive, automatically putting up walls and getting the gloves on, or taking the gloves off rather, ready to fight, or running away. So you said that fight or flight thing, or just wanting to get away from that moment of conflict and cry it out, whatever, and then come back at some point when you're ready. But even then, there's a wall that's built up again because you can't be unlovable. That's just deep within ourselves. It's an essential soul need to be loved, to be known, and to be loved. So you have to put up some kind of wall there to defend against that the next time it comes.
Yeah, and that wall can be avoidance. It can be going on the attack. There's a lot of different.
There's a lot of walls.
Or just you care a little less about that person's opinion every time.
Or you dehumanize them, or you
don't give as much power.
You figure out a way to either reduce their power or cut them down.
Right. And the real the worst thing about that is that eventually, and even if it's not some semblance, even if there's not some truth to it, down the road there may be truth spoken there that you'll just reject altogether.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that happens with there's a few different related ones that we could, for the sake of time, we can't really get into them tonight, but it's the issue of shame.
Yeah, I was just gonna say
this. And really what shame is this condemning voice that says you are not, you are this bad thing, or you are not a worthy thing, or you're not a lovable thing. And I think we talked about shame at some point. There's times where it should drive us to Jesus, but if it becomes kind of part of our identity, then it becomes toxic.
Right.
And what happens sometimes in conflict is knowing that that's there. Someone who struggles with that, they'll be defensive, but then at some point it'll just crush them. And so you have a really hard time living in truth because you can't address small things because they feel like really big things.
Right.
So every single thing says you are not worthy. Like you forgot to take out the trash. You are not worthy. No, you just forgot to take out the trash.
Yeah.
But it's that whole other thing that's just waiting to crush you with condemnation.
And Elizabeth said there, sometimes I feel offended or that I may offend someone. If you're engaging in conflict with the reason to glorify God and restore the relationship, the mess that's going to be created by you coming together and going into conflict, it's going to do that. It's going to glorify God. It's going to reconcile your relationship if that's the goal. If it's to rectify yourself or defend yourself or for any other reason than to restore that relationship and glorify God, you you're going to walk away offended possibly, or end up offending the other person. At least that's what you're going to walk away with. Whether that happens with the other person, you're not responsible for that. But if you go into it with that goal, those goals, glorify God, restore the relationship.
And sometimes putting that out on the table right away, like sometimes like setting up the conversation in that regard, saying like, listen, we both love each other. We're at a place of conflict. The end result is not to walk out and storm out and never speak to each other again. It's to really listen and hear each other and have this center place where we can just hear each other out and move forward in a healthy way. That oftentimes already sets you up for a calmer conflict conversation than, coming at it like this and meeting it head to head.
Yeah, and a lot of it's just, this is how I perceived what you did or what you said. And when you say the way I perceived it, it's the way you received it. Everyone looks at everything through the lens of their own experience. So starting with that, I perceived you doing this, that automatically should deflate any inflammatory comments. But and then Troy says a lack of trust and insecurity. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we're going to actually...
there's more weeks of this.
Down the road, we're going to give you some actual. We're going to give you some actual tools for how to do this. There's some really. They almost seem silly.
No, but
they're not a framework to.
Yes.
When you have a framework to have conflict in, it always helps to go better. It's like, because it's like kind of just trying to navigate without a map. It's like it might work, but it might not. But if you have a framework, it helps a lot. And part, Elizabeth, one of the challenging things with offense is conflict is always offensive. Like when there's a truth about us or about the issue or about the other person that hasn't either dawned on us or that we haven't received yet, it actually does offend us. And it's kind of what we do with it after that moment. And so one of the tricky things with this is there is actually, when you speak truth to someone who hasn't either been aware of it or doesn't really want to hear it, it starts out being offensive. But if the context of that conflict is we want to restore the relationship because we know it's broken and there's something in between us, then it leads somewhere productive. Like Andy, you said, if you leave that with just offense, it hasn't gone anywhere productive. And of course, you can say words just to injure and to harm the other person. And that's another issue. But sometimes there's hard truth. There's things that are not. It's not what anyone wants to hear, but it needs to be said. And so that's a balancing act. We are at the end of our time.
Yeah.
So we'll have a great part 2, and I think a great part 3 to this. But we really appreciate you being on the journey with us. This is not like rainbows and butterflies, but this is the kind of stuff where as believers, as followers of Jesus, if we do a better job with this, we have better relationships, we glorify God, and we actually act as agents of redemption in the world around us. Because in a lot of other places, people just give up. And Jesus doesn't give up on us. And so we have the chance to not give up on ourselves or to give up on people. And as always, if we can pray for you, if we can help you on this journey, we're on the journey very much ourselves. But it's always better to take it together. Our online Connect card is lhcnj.net/connect. And any level of information or anything, we can pray for you, serve you in any way. We would be honored to do that. And we will be back next week, same time, for round 2 of this. Andy, would you like to pray for us as we close out tonight?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, Heavenly Father, now thank you for your son's example of how we should enter conflict and how it glorifies you and strengthens the bond and the unity and even the peace between each other. I pray that we wouldn't be afraid of it, but we wouldn't also abuse it. But that we would learn through the coming weeks, but really by your Spirit, how to engage it in a way that's healthy and resolves it and restores relationship, which in turn glorifies you. And I pray that would be our role and responsibility and desire. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for hanging out. And we'll hang out in the comment section a little bit.
Yep.
And hope you have a great night. And otherwise, we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Yes.
All right. Good
Bye.
night.